You've heard of missing white woman syndrome, but you probably haven't heard a lot about missing white children syndrome. But the reality is, if you go missing in this country and you are white, and that means a white woman or a white child or even a white person, you are likely to have a different response from law enforcement and media. Now, that difference is dramatic when it comes to missing Black children. And even though 40% of missing children in America are Black, and only 14% of the population is comprised of Black children, if you are a Black child and you go missing, the chances of you getting law enforcement to take your case seriously, to elevate it, are not great. The chances of you getting media attention or your family being able to call a press conference or to go on live television and talk about you being missing and to show your picture, again, the chances are not great. Why are there so many disparities in law enforcement and the media when it comes to missing Black children? Today, we're talking to a usatoday.com investigative reporter who's on a mission to change these disheartening, startling, shocking statistics. And we're going to talk to a sister of a 16-year-old who went missing over 25 years ago. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
My first guest today is Gina Barton. She is an investigative reporter with USA Today and the producer and host of the podcast Unsolved. Good morning and welcome, Gina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, Gina, it's such an interesting series that USA Today has taken on, started in May of this year, and I know it goes through March of next year. Tell us why it was important for USA Today and for you to do this series on missing Black children, or missing children of color, I should say.
For about 20 years now, I have been covering the story of Alexis Patterson, who was a 7-year-old Black girl who disappeared from Milwaukee, and she's still missing. And so the 20th anniversary of her disappearance was coming up, and that got us thinking about all these other cases and started wondering, why do the cases of Black children who go missing get less attention from us, the media, and also from the police? And we've all heard about missing white woman syndrome. We know that this is a problem, but what we really wanted to do is drill down and figure out why it happens and is there a way to fix it?
So just for those folks who may not be as familiar with that term, missing white women syndrome, how do you as a journalist define that syndrome?
That was a phrase coined by Gwen Ifill, the late PBS reporter and journalist. And basically, when you have Lacey Peterson, Elizabeth Smart, any kind of young, attractive white woman or girl who goes missing, the media, for lack of a better term, goes crazy. And 24-hour coverage, lots of stories in the newspapers and online. And if a Black girl or woman in a similar circumstance has the same thing happen, there's a lot less coverage, if any coverage at all.
Yeah. And we know the stats I read at the beginning of the show that, 40% of missing children in America are Black, even though Black children only make up 14% of the population. That is such a shocking statistic. I know you've been doing this series now for a while. Have you been able to unearth why are Black children missing at such a disproportionate rate?
I think there's a couple of reasons that we've been able to uncover so far. One of them, the one that's probably the most obvious, is just implicit bias by both police and the media in terms of not giving as much attention to those cases. The other things that we have been able to determine are, in a lot of situations, Black children are labeled runaways, and different police departments have policies that say you don't spend as much time looking for a runaway as you do for some other classification of missing child. And some of the parents I've spoken with have said, hey, the police called my child a runaway, but he or she did not run away and they won't listen to me. So that's an issue. The other issue that I think plays a part is that a disproportionate number of children in the foster care system are Black, and children tend to go missing from the system more often than they go missing from a home with their parents.
Okay. And when a parent contacts law enforcement and says their child is missing, and the police push back, like you just said, and says, no, they're really not missing, they're a runaway, what recourse, if any, does a parent have to really force that law enforcement agency to acknowledge that, this isn't some kind of aberrant child, or, some kind of misbehaving child that's just run away?
I think one of the problems that we have uncovered is that there isn't very much recourse. The police are the ones who decide, do they ask for an Amber Alert, and the state then decides if they're going to issue one or not. And that's putting it up on billboards, maybe sending it out to phones. Is anybody going to look for this child? Are the police going to, knock on doors in the neighborhood or trace cell phones or whatever? And if they think your child is a runaway and their policy says runaways, we don't do those things, then they just don't do them. So then they're left with reaching out to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which parents can reach out to directly on their own. And then the advocates there will kind of help talk with the police and negotiate with them to try and get more done. And then there are also several nonprofit advocacy organizations, two that I've spoken with that focus on missing children of color are Black and Missing, which was featured in an HBO documentary, and Peas in Their Pods, which is another organization based out of Atlanta, but national coverage.
Yeah, we had the founders of Black and Missing on the show a while back and had a chance to talk with them about the work they're doing. Obviously, the HBO special was an important part of lifting up that story. I'm just wondering, in your reporting, in your journalism, have you discovered that there are any cities or counties that are more responsive to Black families in particular when they contact them about a missing child? Like, is it better if you live in Atlanta or better if you live in Chicago? Have you been able to determine that?
So far, we have not seen a lot of difference in terms of who's doing a better job and who's doing a worse job based on geography. The thing that we're seeing is that certain departments have policies that are more helpful and more progressive. For example, in Dallas, if a child has been missing for 30 days, they automatically up them, change their status to say they're high risk, because if you've been gone for 30 days, something's obviously wrong. You're probably being trafficked. And that's so long, 30 days, my God. Okay, so some have policies like that, don't sound very progressive, but I guess you have to compare it to what other agencies are doing. What about the media? Because I know in talking to the Black and Missing group and talking to some actual parents who had adult children who were missing, the other issue was getting media attention, being able to call a press conference, being able to get the media involved. I know I was involved with a missing teenage autistic Black kid a couple of years ago. And because I work in the media, because I was able to get some celebrities who cared about the issue of autism, we were able to do a press conference and to get the child's picture in the news. And we actually found him, several days later. But if you don't have friends who work at, television stations, or you don't have celebrity friends who, the media are more likely to cover, what
happens to the typical family that tries to contact a TV station or, a newspaper?
I think there are several problems. And, one of the things that we want to do with this project is hold ourselves accountable as journalists and as journalists in the USA Today network. So we've been able to figure out a couple of things. One is that in a lot of cases, journalists are dependent on the police, right? So if the police have that bias and they say, oh, this is a runaway, it's not newsworthy, they're not going to put out a news release. If a family member calls a reporter, the reporter will call the police and say, is this a big case? Is this worth writing about? So we need to change that, and we need to evaluate those cases on our own. And the other issue that we have run into is, in journalism, we want to tell a story. So if somebody says this child is missing, the first thing we would want to do is talk to a family member, right? Talk to a parent or a sibling, aunt, uncle, somebody close to the child who can actually tell us the story of that child. But if a child goes missing from a group home, for example, or a foster care placement, maybe they don't have a parent who is in a position to do that. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to work harder to find surrogates. Is there a pastor, a teacher, right, somebody else who can talk to us about that child? So one of the things we're doing through this project is we are featuring long-term missing children of color who did not get the coverage that they should have gotten back in the past. And we're trying to right that wrong now as we can.
I know that Alexis Patterson, the 7-year-old who went missing from Milwaukee, that was kind of the catalyst for the series. It's my understanding that she still, to this day, 20 years later, has not been found. She's 27 years old now. It's such a sad story, because even 20 years later, the police have still not cleared her mother as a suspect. Wow. So she's called the police to try to get help, has called the FBI, and they want her to take another polygraph test. She spoke with a cold case detective who said, when are you going to tell me what happened? And I just kind of feel like it's been 20 years. She's been out there in the media. She's in very regular contact with me and with other reporters. She had a big event on the 20th anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. And I just feel that if she had done something to her own child, would she be doing that? The police's suspicion is that she maybe killed the child or something, because you can't be hiding a 27-year-old, right? So
right, no. Possible. Yeah, I mean, either that she killed her own daughter, or that she knows what happened. Somebody close to her, her then husband was a suspect. He is now deceased, but they think maybe he did something to her, and Alexis's mom knows about it, but she's told me she doesn't. And I just think if she did know something, she would kind of stay quiet and try to stay out of the public eye.
So I know you're going to do a podcast series, You're Unsolved. You're going to feature Alexis's mom in your next series of episodes. What's the goal there? Are you still trying to get the word out that, we're looking for you, Alexis, or what's the purpose?
Basically, I am doing the best I can to try and help Alexis's mom find her daughter or figure out what happened to her. We are hopeful that we will be able to get some of the police records that we haven't been able to get for 20 years. They've been resisting that because the case is still open, but we've reached an agreement with them now where we're going to be getting those. So we'll be able to actually see, were there viable leads that they didn't follow up on, or maybe that they did follow up on, but they didn't take them as far as they could. I've talked to, go ahead. I've talked to several people who have told me they've called the police with tips about what may have happened to Alexis, and the police really didn't do anything. So I'm going to try to put those out there in the public and see if anyone else knows about them.
Do you believe, Gina, that the bias that you just described that happens in the media and law enforcement when parents call about Black kids is also driving how they're treating Alexis's mom? You know, why she's still a support?
That's a really tough question, and one that I've turned over and over in my mind, because when Alexis disappeared, there was a lot done to try to find her. I mean, it was a full court press by the police in Milwaukee and also by the Milwaukee media. So the current police chief, who was a detective at the time, has said that it's obviously there's a problem with race and policing in Milwaukee, as there is in a lot of other places. Although he was quick to point out that the chief at the time was Black and the current chief in Milwaukee is Black also. So I think that they would say they just can't leave any stone unturned. It's usually the parents, and they just haven't been able to clear Alexis's mother or stepfather, and so they have to keep them on the list.
I want to bring into this conversation Lisa Allen. Her 16-year-old sister, Jeffrey Lynn, went missing over 30 years ago. And she believes that race and racism played a part in how her family was treated by law enforcement and the media. Good morning, Lisa, and thank you so much for joining us. I just want to start by asking, give us a little background about your sister and the circumstances under which she went missing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Areva, for having me on the show this morning. I really appreciate it. My sister, Jeffrey Lynn Smith, has been missing since 1985 from Hot Springs, Arkansas. And we have been vigilant during that whole span of trying to find out what happened to her. She went missing. She went to school. She did not show back up home later that evening. And that's when we started getting worried, because she's never had any situation where she didn't come home. We did have her classified as a missing person. Unfortunately for us, the law enforcement at that time, as is the case with a lot of missing children, do initially classify as a runaway, as opposed to looking at questionable circumstances. There were questionable circumstances. As a matter of fact, the person that was last seen with her boyfriend at the time pawned her ring, a prize ring that she would never have taken off for anything. He never made mention of that. Never made mention of the fact that he departed the ring. However, he helped us look for her all those weeks after she went missing, and then we found that out. So
was he ever a suspect? Did the law enforcement ever consider the boyfriend a suspect?
I think that it off the record, so to speak. I mean, they looked into. Let me fast forward many years later. After not getting any type of support, I got connected with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and that was in 2007. And it's at that time that things started really happening for us, in that from 1985 to 2007, we didn't have any support. My family, all of us basically were walking around like zombies, not really having any support, not even knowing that there was an organization out there that could help us. So when I got involved with the National Center, connected with them, that's when our DNA was uploaded to the database. That's when we started getting age progressions and posters distributed about her, start learning about all the other missing children and supports that was out there. That's when I got the strength that I had to go back to Arkansas. And I learned these years later that the boyfriend whom we suspected in my sister's disappearance had also had a very violent past since then, and has actually served prison time for attempted murder on another female. And I went back and interviewed. I actually became a detective on my own because law enforcement wasn't really helping us back then. So I'm like, I got to do something. I interviewed these ladies. I recall very, vividly with my mom traveling across country to do this. And we ended up settling in Topeka, Kansas, And one night in December of that year, I emailed the lead detective in the case and told him, basically transcribed these interviews of these young ladies that had since had a relationship with this man. And that's when the case was opened back up. That's when it became, I guess, obvious to everybody that something bad probably did happen to my sister, because one of the young ladies did mention this individual who was last seen with her. And I can mention his name because, I know who it is. Frank had basically made all types of statements that my sister would never be found. And so that's when they opened the case up again. And that's when they started looking into him going to interview prison inmates that he had been in the prison with, and they made statements. And those types of interviews are what culminated in actually a search for her body in a park in Hot Springs.
And were they able to find her body?
Unfortunately, no, we did not find any type of remains for my sister. There were some remains found, but they later determined to be not human. But, everything is, pointing to this person. That's the reason why, like this in so many cases, why it's important to get media exposure, because people have aged. It's been over 37 years. They forgot about it. They put it in the back of their minds. They're thinking that, she either found or she's, deceased. They don't really know. So we're trying to bring this back up to, to everybody's minds, because at the end of the day, somebody knows what happened.
Right. Let me ask Gina a question. So Gina, how common is the story that Lisa's telling about her sisters? Is this a familiar story that you've heard as you've done this investigative series?
Unfortunately, I really think it is. I was just doing some research yesterday, and I came across a story of a 15-year-old girl in Cleveland who told her parents she was going to catch the bus to school and then didn't. And they reported her missing. She was classified as a runaway. And a week and a half later, they found her body after her parents had said, she's been sexually assaulted by this ex-boyfriend. We think she's at his house. And apparently the police knocked on a door where the parents thought she was and said, is she here? And the people said no. And so they left. and then, tragically they found her deceased. So I understand that police work is difficult and there are lots of missing children's cases, but it seems to me that somebody needs to take a look at this problem and figure out, why don't the police have the resources they need to pursue these cases? What can be done to help them overcome implicit bias or just bias in general? And the other thing is, I think that people need to realize, even if a child does run away of their own accord, a teenager, that doesn't mean they're not in danger. They could be trafficked, they could be attacked, they could be robbed, they have no food, they have nowhere to live, particularly 13, 14, 15-year-old children, they can't get a driver's license, they can't get a job. So what some of the police officers have told me is, in that situation, even if they have run away, their only option to survive is either to sell themselves or to accept help from someone who might not have their best interests in mind.
Yeah, I was thinking that, Gina, as you talked about the distinction that the police officers make between missing and a runaway. If you are 12 and your little 12-year-old mind tells you, I don't like that my mother told me to wash the dishes, so I'm going to run away. That's not an adult decision. That's being a petulant, compulsive child who probably 30 minutes to an hour later realizes, that maybe wasn't the best decision. Now I want to go home. So this notion that somehow because the kid runs away, they're not deserving of law enforcement attention or media attention, where did that concept come from? That seems bizarre to me, that a 12-year-old who makes, a really childish, decision, because they are a child, that they aren't deserving of protection.
Well, and I have a 14-year-old son, and I have to tell you, if he disappeared, I would be panicked. Like, I wouldn't, even if I thought he ran away, he can't take care of himself.
Yeah, I mean, and they can't make their brains aren't fully developed where they can make good decisions. And the kid that gets angry, that storms out the house, once they get hungry, they start missing their television, they miss their, iPhone, their iPad, their they want to go back home. But as you said, somebody by then could have abducted them, could have, led them into some sort of danger. So do you know why police make this artificial distinction between, quote unquote, you ran away or you're missing?
I think the main reason is that the vast majority of children who are reported missing are found within a day or two. They generally are found pretty quickly. The example that you gave, the kid starts missing his iPad and he gets on the bus and comes back home. So I understand that the police don't have unlimited resources and they can't, throw 50 officers at every child who is reported missing right away. But it seems to me that the way they make those decisions is arbitrary. Going back to Dallas, which we had talked about before, the 30 days, and you said, wow, that sounds like a long time. But some departments never give that child high priority. They just say, like, they ran away. There's nothing we can do. They file the report and forget about it. So I think that some more has to be done on the front end in terms of, it shouldn't necessarily be a cutoff age. It shouldn't be, do we think they ran away or not? There should be some other criteria that helps law enforcement figure out, is this a case that we should throw many resources at immediately? Because the reality is they just don't have the manpower or the finances to do that for everyone.
Well, you say that, Gina, and what we do know is, as you mentioned earlier, Lacey Peterson and some of the white women that go missing, seemingly there's all of a sudden all of these resources, both on the law enforcement front and the media front. So they pick and choose how they deploy resources that they have. So Lisa, I want to ask you, in the case of your sister at the initial stage of 16, when she was, didn't come home from school, was there an initial full court press by the law enforcement agents in that town to look for her? And did you get any media attention in the early days of her being missing?
We received absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, we had to pay for an ad in the paper. So that's what our exposure was. We actually put out our own ad in the paper. And I will make a couple of follow-up points to what you've been saying. It is true that majority of the children are, in fact, have run away or may have a history of repeated running away. But the scenario remains true that there's predators out there, there's people, opportunists that are actually looking for those children, because when they, when they're vulnerable, when like you said, when they get hungry, they're sick, they start seeking out, friendships and comrades or what have you, and they stumble upon the wrong individuals, and that is when it goes a different direction. So there definitely needs to be more effort put into either task force or somebody dedicated to the runaway and the missing children, rather than having, like each officer, each person responding as the best as they can with their limited resources. And I will say there are some wonderful law enforcement officials and officers out there that do amazing work. I know when my sister's case was reopened back in 2007, Detective Leah Clem, she went hard to try to help us. I mean, she pounded the pavement. She went out there, she re-interviewed people. And what was very discouraging was the fact that I had to look at the initial police report years later to say what was right, what was accurate, and all these types of things. And the police report actually said that they interviewed my mother, and my mother had said my sister had returned, which was a blatant, outright falsehood. And there were many falsehoods in there. They indicated that they had interviewed Frank, the suspect, and they had not. It was very, very disturbing. So there has to be not only more energy and focus put in those areas, but also oversight as well. So that these bias issues, you get fair treatment. I recall, like you said, when Natalee Holloway went missing, all of the media exposure, it was like blasted across every news cycle there was. And I recall, if my sister could only get one segment of that attention, maybe this could have been resolved back then. So there has to be some kind of balance. I'm not going to, wish that no child get less coverage or what have you, but there has to be some balance, because at the end of the day, people knew about Natalee, but they didn't know about so many other children.
Let me ask you this, Gina. What are you hoping through this investigative series that USA Today is doing? I know you said you're going back and giving news coverage, media coverage to those stories that didn't get the kind of attention that, they should have gotten. How are you engaging the public around these stories?
In addition to putting those stories out on the website, we have been working closely with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and populating our Twitter feeds with a lot of the missing kids posters that they've been putting out and things like that. We are also going to, in the podcast, offer them some ad breaks where they can talk about different missing kids and refer people back to the website so that they can see the pictures. And we're interviewing people like Lisa and other family members of kids who have been missing for a long time to try to get them that exposure. So I realize that it isn't enough, and that, one news organization can't fix this overnight or alone. But we are really hoping that if we can get to some of the reasons that these things happen, we can make a change. So, for example, if we can get police departments to do away with that runaway designation,
right,
and treat all cases the same, that would be the kind of impact that I think would really help a lot of families.
And I'm even thinking, Gina and Lisa, going back to John Benet Ramsey, remember that case that got so much media attention? It became the subject of, movies and series. It was just, it was the media saturation. And then more recently, the Gabby Petito case, which is another case. And when Gabby's case was going on, we had a journalist, a woman who teaches journalism, but who used to also run news rooms at different television stations. And she said that the reality is that the folks that are in high positions in most news organizations tend to be white, mostly white males, and they just don't value Black women and stories about Black people the way that people of color who, if they had more of those positions would. What do you think of that? Gina, do you think that that is part of the problem, that the decision makers at the top who, green light stories just don't have the kind of sensibilities around the importance of Black women and Black children?
I haven't worked in television, so I can only speak to traditional newspapers. I think that is true, that white men run most of these organizations. However, I can say that as a reporter, I have never had one of those white men tell me what story to cover. Like, it's generally been up to the reporters to cover those stories. So I do think it would be helpful. And in this case, I'm really grateful to my bosses at USA Today, because when I pitched this project, they were able to see the value in it and to see the value in us taking responsibility for our past coverage or lack of coverage.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that that plays a role in terms of the people who are running the newsroom do have the final say on what stories get covered.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, when it comes to individual cases, if Lisa or her mother would have called me way back when I was the police reporter, if I had been the police reporter in the town where her sister disappeared, I wouldn't have had to ask my editor, can I cover this story? I probably would have talked to the family and then called the police and then decided, is this story worth pursuing or not? And that might also be part of the problem, because I'm a white woman, and a white male reporter or a reporter of color might have a different idea about, is that story worth covering?
And Gina, let me ask you this. We know race obviously is playing a big role in how these cases are both investigated by police officers. And we know there are great police officers out there, but we know as a system, our policing system suffers from a great deal of, institutional and systemic racism and bias. And I would even say, gender bias as well as racial bias. What about economics? Gina, do you see any difference in any of these stories, whereas a poor family, if you're a poor Black family versus if you're more, highly educated or affluent family, does that play into it? So if a judge's kid goes missing, or a politician, or, someone who has status in our society, would that make a difference? Or do you see that making a difference?
I definitely do see that making a difference. Obviously, if a judge's child goes missing, that's immediately news, because a judge is a person who's in the public eye, who's a public figure, who we've reported on before. So anything that happens to his or her family is going to be a story.
Mm-hmm.
The other point that you made that I think is really interesting is those connections, right? So if you are a middle class or upper middle class white family, you're going to know more journalists, you're going to know more police officers, you're going to know more people in power. Maybe you're going to have somebody who can refer.
You're going to hire a lawyer. I mean, you're going to hire a high-powered lawyer who will have those connections, even if you don't have them.
Mm-hmm.
Or a Gabby Petito case. Most of those cases have spokespersons. They have lawyers very early on in the cases.
Areva, I wanted to interject something, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the point you're making is so true. How do you bring your case out of obscurity? And that's where I started. In my sister's case, and I've tried to ride the coattails off of this. My mother and my grandmother both worked for former President Bill Clinton's mom. We're from Hot Springs, Arkansas, and that's where they, lived and raised children and all those types of things. So my mom and my grandmom actually was a housekeeper and babysitter from there. My mom babysitted Roger Clinton, and it wasn't until I actually started trying to use that connection that I actually started getting some attention. And that really is kind of like a sad commentary when you really think about it, that I had to go back and use my mom being a maid or a housekeeper for a prominent white man to get my sister some media exposure. But, at that point in time and moving in any means necessary.
Did you think, Lisa, at the time, did you and your mom think, wow, okay, I cleaned the house for I guess this is in the 80s. So was Clinton in office? No,
he was not in office, but my mom worked for them when he was at school in Oxford. Okay. And that's actually, my mom was pregnant with my sister, Jeffrey Lynn Smith, when she was working for them. And matter of fact, because Mrs. Dwyer, this is the story, her husband at the time, Jeffrey, did not have children together. My Mrs. Clinton Dwyer at the time was a nurse anesthesiologist for my mom, because my mom didn't have the insurance, and she wanted her to be comfortable during her birth. So she was there for her. And I went back and got the medical records. Did your family think about trying to leverage that relationship with this prominent white family at the time? Oh yeah. I mean, I reached out to them. I sent letters. I did everything. It came back, not returned. I have the envelopes that basically say they were returned or what have you. So I don't know if it ever really reached them,
Mhm.
but she had already passed on.
Oh,
The
okay.
mom.
She had passed on.
Yeah,
Okay.
she had passed on. So
Yeah. So I'm sorry, the Unsolved podcast that you're going to do, Gina, you're going to interview Lisa, tell the story of her sister. I know you're going to talk to Alexis Patterson's uh, mom. Are there any other stories that you're going to feature in this podcast?
The main focus of the podcast is going to be the Alexis Patterson case, but we are going to bring in other cases and other statistics and some of the investigative findings that you and I have been talking about today, just to raise that awareness to as many cases as we can.
And you mentioned trafficking, sex trafficking, we know is a huge issue. How many, if you've been able to determine, Gina, what percentage of these girls and guys, but particularly girls that go missing, end up being, prostituted or, sex trafficked by some predator?
Lisa might be able to speak to a percentage more than I can since she's worked with the National Center. But I do know that it's a high percentage. And I know that Black girls particularly are falling victim to this. Another thing that I think it's important to talk about is the concept of Black girls being adultified and being treated as more mature, more grown up than they actually are. So I had one police officer tell me that a 15-year-old Black girl who goes missing is actually at higher risk than a 10-year-old, because there's a certain kind of person who wants to molest a 10-year-old, but there's a lot more men out there who would not bother to ask how old the 16-year-old is and just assume she's an adult or treat her like an adult. So it's a huge problem, and the predators are out there for sure.
Yeah. Do you have that number, Lisa, the percentage of these girls that do end up getting sex trafficked? And you're right, Gina, this adultification is a huge issue. And oftentimes we'll hear police officers refer to Black children and not call them children, not even recognize that they are kids and are given the same kind of, developmental designation that we see given to white kids. So, Lisa, what does your research tell you about the sex trafficking piece?
Yes, I don't have the specific percentages per se, but I know that roughly 15 to 50,000 women and children are forced into these type of situations with sex trafficking. We do have the National Center for Missing Exploited Children. I've been a consultant with them since 2016. Do have a special team set up to support the exploited children and their families. And so they outreach to them just as we outreach to those that have missing, runaway children or what have you, to provide emotional support to those families. But the numbers are staggering. I don't have the specific percentage though.
So Lisa, you now have dedicated your professional life. You said you're a consultant for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. When did you make that decision that your sister's case was so significant that you wanted to help other families?
In 2007, when I started getting support from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and specifically the Team Hope program. Team Hope is a program that is, funded by the Department of Justice. It's a program of family advocacy of the National Center, and all of the volunteers is a volunteer program where we reach out and support other family members. Every day, children go missing. Every day, families need support. I started volunteering in 2007, and in 2016, I became a consultant. As a consultant, basically, now I support a team of volunteers in the mountain region, providing ongoing training, coaching, and support so they can do the outreach to these families. I consider it a very healing. I feel like I'm doing work in my sister's name, so her life goes without with meaning. And I think that's why we all do the work, because with that, us being, we don't like to say we're in this club nobody wants to be in, but we get strength from one another. And I feel like I've helped a lot of people in my sister's name. So with that being said, I think she's done a lot of work over the span of my engagement with them.
That is amazing. And just kudos to you for taking something so painful and turning it into something so purposeful. Not many people could do that. Gina, I just want to end by asking you, what should we expect for the rest of this series? We're now in December. You said the series goes through March. People can find new articles, new stories approximately once every month on usatoday.com. What's upcoming in the series?
Upcoming, we've got a couple of stories. The next two are about Amber Alerts, and Amber Alerts are not as easy to get as everyone thinks they are. So, for example, we're looking at a case in Indiana where a little boy disappeared with his 21-year-old emotionally and intellectually disabled aunt, and they were denied an Amber Alert, and he's still missing many years later. And then also working on a story about some of these age cutoffs. So some police departments will say any child 9 and under is automatically considered at risk. Any child 10 to 17 is automatically considered a runaway. So we've looked at more than 50 police departments, and we'll be able to tell you which departments have that cutoff at 9, and then some departments treat anyone up to 21 the same. And then early next year, we will have a big story where we will actually be able to quantify how often are police departments classifying Black children as runaways versus white children. So we've collected thousands and thousands of records from police departments around the country, and we're analyzing them right now to see how often do you have the exact same circumstances and a white child is treated differently, and is that happening more often in one department or another?
So ultimately, what's your goal, Gina, through this series? Is it to change the policies of some of these police departments as well as some of these media outlets and their policies towards covering missing Black children?
Definitely. I mean, as an investigative reporter, I always want my work to have impact. So the first thing that I really hope we are able to do is bring home some of these children that we're writing about, because they need to be found. They need to be able to come home. Their families need them. And then the other thing that I think we would like to be able to accomplish is to put the pressure on law enforcement and on state legislatures to implement some policies that are going to be more fair and effective when it comes to finding missing Black children. And so we'll have a story about that too, about here are some of the strategies that are working in various states or even other countries, and can we implement them here? And let's do that.
Well, really, again, thank you for the work you're doing, Gina, individually, and thanks to USA Today for, as you said, giving you the green light and giving you the resources to be able to cover, these stories and help these families. And I know, as Lisa just said, obviously getting the kids back home is priority number one, but I'm sure for families, just being able to be heard, just for someone to say your child matters, your story matters, your pain, your grief matters, has to be so healing for these families who have suffered and lived through these. I mean, what's the most unimaginable trauma? I'm just thinking, when someone is dead, that's painful enough, but there's closure. But to be walking around every day thinking, my God, might I run into them in a grocery store? They may show up any place. That must be the most just painful way to kind of go through life. And Lisa, I know you as a consultant do we know how many children are found? So Gina is hoping that we find some of these kids, that they get returned to their families through the work she's doing. Are there any stats out there through the National Center about how many kids just go missing forever? Do we know any of those stats?
I actually meant to look that up before I got on here. I mean, our time was kind of mixed up a little bit, but I will say that as a consultant, we make these calls every day, basically. And the majority, I'd say, and roughly in the 90s, they come home, they are located. Majority of the cases that I have in my database right now, they have recovery status. Those calls are confirmed through the families. They say, oh, my child came back home, or either law enforcement, they're picking them up, because the posters have been distributed and people are giving leads, which I want to say that's so important. So if your viewers hear this message, one of the most important things you can do to advocate for missing children is to share the posters, because that's how they're found. Either sometimes they see themselves and they say, I got to get home, or the person's, there's been a situation where people that they were hiding out with saw the posters and said, oh, this is serious. I need to get this child back home.
Right.
So that's important. But the majority of the children are found. We do unfortunately have situations where children are recovered deceased. We do have situations where children are missing for long-term. We have long-term missing cases, such as myself, where they have never been any leads. So it's
just heartbreaking. I want to ask you finally, Lisa, is the center doing anything to address some of the issues that Gina talked about in terms of either helping to address this implicit bias in law enforcement, or to address the implicit bias in media coverage, so that we are not saturated with white missing people and children, and, totally devoid of coverage for Black children? And obviously, we don't want to take coverage away from white kids. We want them found too. This isn't about either or. It's not a binary choice. Find the Black kids or find the white kids. We want all these kids to be found. So is the center doing anything with respect to helping change some of these systems?
Yes, the center not only supports, but facilitates lots of law enforcement trainings, bringing them actually into the National Center for training on how to, even they have them come in and talk to us. I've been in the rooms with law enforcement, lead detectives and chiefs, and basically let them know our perspectives. And I think that's important, to really hear the voices of not only families of missing, children, but the missing children of color.
Yeah.
And I do know that there's ongoing diversity initiatives within the National Center and within our the program to help people understand, again, how implicit biases play out, and the importance of media exposure and those types of things. I know that the National Center has outreach to quite a few families with missing children of color, to provide media exposure on the website out there. They've done blog posts. They do media blasts via Facebook, and programs and platforms such as yourself, such as this, is so critical, because we know that social media is like, it's not what we call quote unquote mainstream, but it gets out there. Things they can take off very quickly. So I'm very appreciative of being on your show today, and I will take this with me and I'll share, and in hopes that we get some answers, and some answers from some other families as well. So really, thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Well, thank you for, again, having the courage to take that unimaginable situation with your family and become a leader now and a voice for those families that don't have a voice. Again, if you have a child that has gone missing, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has resources, as Lisa just shared with us. They have support groups. They have, strategies and tools that you can use to help find your child. There's also missingandblack.com is another resource that families can turn to. And again, I want to make sure everyone is following Gina Barton and the work that she's doing with the USA Today series. Hopefully your work, Gina, will inspire some of the other mainstream print organizations, the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, so many of them. I'd love to see them step into this space and use their enormous platforms in the way that USA Today is using its platform to elevate this story and elevate the stories of Black children, because our children matter. They are just as precious to our communities, to our families, and to our nation as, all other children are. So again, thanks, ladies, for the work that the both of you are doing. Look forward to that podcast, Unsolved. When will the first episode drop, Gina?
We're planning on dropping the first episode in late January, early February.
Okay. And again, that's Unsolved, and where can it be found?
It can be found on the website of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And also, if you just pull it up in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the first 3 seasons are there now, so people can start listening and subscribe, and then they'll be notified when the new season begins.
Fantastic. Again, thank you so much, Gina. Thank you, Lisa. We'll be following as many of these stories and definitely using our platform to get the word out about your sister, Lisa Jeffrey Lynn, and anything that we can do, Gina, to help amplify the stories that you are telling on your podcast or in your series. Definitely let us know, because this is an issue that's important to me. Like I said, I've been involved in trying to help find. Fortunately, in our case, we were able to bring this teenager home to his family. It took 3 or 4 days, but it took a lot of advocacy. And, I am a civil rights lawyer. I'm an advocate, so I was able to cut through it. But I was just, as I was going through it, thinking about how difficult it is for families to get the right police department personnel to hear them and to take action. It took me calling every elected official I pretty much know in Los Angeles and being able to actually have to call the police chief to get this kid's case elevated in a way that it needed to be elevated. But because of that work and the work of the community in Los Angeles, the autism community was very helpful. We were able to bring this kid home. So this definitely takes a village. This work takes a village, and it takes all of us to be dedicated to this work. Again, thank you, ladies, for joining me this morning. I want to thank Lisa for her courage. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to have such a painful experience, to still have no closure with respect to the missing status of her sister, Jeffrey Lynn. But then to take that, as she said, to go into the town where her sister went missing, to become herself a detective, an investigative reporter, to do interviews, and then to use that information to try to re-engage law enforcement. And then to take everything that she learned through that process to become a volunteer with the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and now a consultant where she is actually leading a team of volunteers. That is the ultimate definition of a servant leader. And I just have so much respect and admiration for what Lisa is doing. And also want to give a big shout out to Gina. It takes a lot to go into a newsroom and say you want to write a whole year of stories about missing Black women that society is pretty much written off. Missing Black children. I call them women because some of them have been missing for so long, they are now adults. And even though Gina said her white bosses have never denied her, any opportunity to tell a story that she wanted to tell, I know from so many of my friends who are journalists, who are both in print media as well as work in television, that that's not always the case, that they often get shot down when they try to tell stories about Black people, whether it's missing Black people or even sometimes just a positive story about a Black person or a Black family. So again, a lot of respect for the work that Gina is doing. Hope that that work leads to, as she said, some real policy changes, that legislatures around this country start looking at what they can do to make it easier for Black families to get the support they need from law enforcement and media when their children go missing. And hopefully, as I said to Gina, other networks, other print media organizations will follow the lead of usatoday.com and dedicate some of their time and some of their resources to elevating these stories to the kind of national prominence that they deserve. And I'm hoping my friends in TV, in the news business, whether it's cable or network, also start to look at how these stories are being told. And again, as I said, don't choose not to cover the white missing people or white missing children, but don't exclusively cover those stories while you totally ignore the stories of Black missing children and Black missing people. Our kids are valuable. Our kids have value. They have worth, and they are kids. A 15-year-old is a kid. A 15-year-old is not an adult, despite what predators may think. So even when a teenager goes missing, and running away in my book is missing, if you leave home and you don't return, you are missing. This false designation of runaway versus someone who is missing is causing us to lose valuable time and resources that should be deployed in the early stages when a family calls a law enforcement agency to say, my child hasn't come home. We can deal with whether the child made an active choice to walk out the door or whether someone abducted the child. But the fact is, they are children. And when they are missing, they are in danger and they need our help. They need the help of law enforcement. They need the help of media. They need the help of community. So you can volunteer yourself. You don't have to be in law enforcement. You don't have to be in the media. You can volunteer with the center by contacting missingkids.org. And if you have a child or you know of a child that is missing, make sure you contact the Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Again, their website is missingkids.org. That's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And make sure you follow Gina's brilliant series on missing children. Every month, she drops a new article about a family trying to help bring that person back. And then follow her podcast. Go, as she said, to Spotify, Apple, find that podcast and make sure you follow the Alexis Patterson story that she says will start to drop at the end of January. These are such important stories. And Lisa and Gina were thanking me, but I want to thank them. It is my honor, it's my privilege to be able to use my platform to help give a voice to those missing children and to hopefully help move policymakers in the right direction so that we aren't talking a year from now, 5 years from 10 years from now about the fact that Black children go missing and no one seems to care. Be safe out there and remember, we're all in this together.